Welcome to Lean in Leander. I'm your host, Andrew Naudine, and in this episode, I have the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with Kat Howell. Kat is a member of the Historical Preservation Commission here in Leander. She's also the Leander area historian. Her and her mother, Karen, spent several years working on a book on the history of Leander, and Kat is a wellspring of knowledge when it comes to the history of this area. And she is really a pleasure to sit down and talk to. So I wanted to share that with my listeners and give you an idea, if you've never heard the stories, of some of the things that have occurred here in Leander. It's really quite a fascinating history overall, and Kat knows it all. So enjoy this episode. If you're listening to the podcast, turn it up a bit. If you're watching at home, just sit back, grab a drink, and enjoy this conversation with Kat Howell. Hey everybody, I'm sitting here with Kat Howell, who is basically the historian for the city of Leander, right? I think that's a fair way to say it.
Yeah.
So she's taking some time here with me today to talk a little bit about the history here in Leander. And we're going to talk about a couple of the projects that she's working on right now, as well as the book that her and her mother wrote, I think a couple of years ago now, right?
Yes,
Okay.
2019.
2019. So it's pretty fresh off the presses, sans COVID delay. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so again, thank you, Kat. I appreciate you taking the time to come with us.
Okay. I appreciate it.
All right. So, Kat, I appreciate you spending some time with me here today. What I really want to try to do is focus in on some of the things that have happened in Leander. I know that you are an extreme expert on all the things that have happened here in the city. So we're going to try to kind of keep you weaving through some topics that we've agreed on, but don't be surprised if we go off the track.
Right.
So what I want to start with is we kind of want to start kind of at the beginning. And I think the way that you frame this typically is like the Paleo Indians, I think is what you call it. So let's start there.
Okay. So Leander, Cedar Park, that area, this part of the world, we are blessed that we have the oldest ritualistic burial in North America. She's called Leanderthal Lady. Mm-hmm. She was actually She was actually found in a grave site along Brushy Creek, almost to 1431.
Okay.
The burial site was found in preparation for actually building 1431. So that was close to there. But the TxDOT decided to name her Leanderthal because it had a better rhyme.
Right.
And also, too, most people don't realize this, but up until, let's say, about 2000, Cedar Park was actually kind of considered a suburb of Leander.
Oh.
Leander was established first, and it was really the center of economic and social life for this whole area. So Leander, and part of that is because we had the train station.
Right.
We had the train station, and the train, part of the reason where Leander was placed where Leander is that's where we could get water. And which leads into, we had the Paleo Indians, which the Leanderthal Lady was. And then the next tribe that we know of in the history that we name are the Tonkawa.
Okay.
And the Tonkawa Indians, they were here for millennia.
Okay.
So we moved from the Paleo Indians to the Tonkawa. And then after Spain came to the New World, and they brought with them cattle and horses, the cattle, horses, hogs, the domesticated animals.
Yeah, livestock.
The livestock, sheep, goats, they all went feral. Some of them got away.
I gotcha. Okay.
And the horses became wild horses, which we still have wild horses in other parts of the United States.
Right.
They're beautiful animals.
Right.
Wild horses are beautiful. Well, the native tribes, the native peoples in the United States, they saw the benefit domesticating the wild horses again, and certain tribes were better at it than others, and the tribes of the Plain States were the best at it. The Comanche, the Cherokee, Apache, those tribes. And those tribes also happened to be the ones that were the more warring tribes.
Right.
So after Spain came here, and the Cherokee and the Comanche got horses, they started moving the other tribes out. The Tonkawa, they were kind of warring tribe, but not to the extent that the others were. And the Comanche essentially forced the Tonkawa out of this area.
Gotcha.
And then, unfortunately, of course, later on down the road, that's when we had the Trail of Tears, and the Tonkawa were forced out of Texas altogether into Oklahoma.
Okay. One of the things that you told me about that when we talked initially was, is this Tonkawa, the language that you're using here?
That is Tonkawa.
Okay. So there's a new little, ironically, I think this is probably the most ironic thing that we have in Leander.
Absolutely
okay?
Most ironic here.
Absolutely. I mean,
no doubt.
Inferred people figure this one out. So I'm going to let you pronounce it, but Leander was called, or at least referred to, as the land of good water, right?
Yes. So this picture here,
it's interesting.
The Tonkawa, this line drawing here, the colors are mine.
Mm-hmm.
That's my own interpretation. So where the blue is, that's clearly a creek. That's water. That the orange is earth. The green is a tree, and then the sky is yellow. This stick drawing with the circle, this is the stick drawing of what the Tonkawa would describe this area. And then there are no native Tonkawan speakers left.
Okay.
And the Tonkawan language is a standalone language. There is no other language that is similar to it. So I honestly do not know how to pronounce. This is the translation of how it is pronounced. Takachue Pouetsu. Do you want to try?
I think that looks like Takachue Pouetsu. I guess. I don't know.
I do know.
Not a linguist.
I do know. Not either. I do know that the Tonkawan was translated into Spanish in 1716, and then I think it was 1751 that it was translated from Spanish to English.
Gotcha.
And this is land of good water is what it translates to, and that's how they described this area.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, again, the irony there is obvious, for anybody who follows Leander anything. The water's been kind of a thing, So.
We used to have lots of natural springs.
Mm-hmm.
We still have some. The Brushy Creek, which runs right behind us.
Yeah,
right
close
here,
by where
right
we
here.
are. Yeah.
This is the headwaters of the Brushy Creek. And actually where the Travis County, Williamson County line is, which is literally, if we walk out the door from where we are, we can see it.
Mm-hmm.
All the water in Williamson County runs to the Brazos River. So the Brushy Creek, that's literally where it starts, right outside our door here.
Right.
And then all the water for Travis County it's the watershed into Colorado. And that line is where you divide Williamson County and Travis County. So literally right outside our door.
Yeah, no, because I know,
Creek.
I mean, we're here on Lakeline, right off of Lakeline, and you can go across Lakeline right now, the little 2-lane part that's close to Hero. And there's a plot of land here on the other side of the street, but there's a kind of like almost a cliff. And I think when you get to the bottom of that cliff, it's Apple Springs, I want to say.
Apple Springs.
Apple Springs. And that's
Travis
in Travis, right? Yeah. So you can kind of walk. You can walk over here and you can see it.
Yeah.
The dog loves to go that direction for whatever reason.
So Brushy Creek has been here. Well, we know because of the Neanderthal lady, we know it's been here at least 13,000 years.
Wow.
And then to our north is the San Gabriel River, which has dinosaur tracks in it. So we know that the San Gabriel River has been here at least since the dinosaur time.
Interesting.
So we're in between two pieces of water. And unfortunately, we have lost a lot of our history from that era, the Paleo Indians and beyond, because we have neighborhoods that have
Right.
been built
Right.
on top of the Indian middens.
Yeah, that's always such a shame because, I mean, the drumbeat of progress beats eternally. Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, you see it historically anywhere in the world. Just either progress and growth or renewal, and they just build on top of old buildings and things of that nature.
Yeah. Well,
So,
Europe is full of it.
yeah, no, Europe is. When we traveled to Europe a couple of summers ago, that's one of the more fascinating things that I found.
Here, we have whole neighborhoods that are built on top of Indian middens. There's people out there that their home is on top of an Indian midden, which was their trash pile.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a few homes around here that, not in Leander, that have been built on top of cemeteries. And
Interesting.
Round Rock has that problem.
Is there? I mean, I don't know if you would know this, but I thought about this the other day when we were talking about it. It was one of the little notes that I made. I'm wondering now, with a lot of the ground sonar and things of that nature that they use in a lot of archaeological digs, I'm wondering if that might even be something that they can find another way to kind of maybe explore that stuff.
I think it's still too expensive to do that.
Okay.
But I have been on quite a few archaeological digs where the ground penetrating radar was used.
Okay.
And I've actually watched the technology. One of the very first uses for it in a cemetery was actually in Jollyville, right down the road. Mm-hmm. And my mother arranged for that to happen at
that's cool.
one of the cemeteries down there.
So. I've seen it on TV. Mm-hmm. I can't say that I've seen it live, but it looks fascinating to me. I mean,
it absolutely is. And as the technology has improved, it's basically like a X-ray shot of what's underground.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just fascinating.
The one place that I watch where they're using it really quite a lot, from what I can gather, is in Stonehenge in England, because they keep continuing to find that what they thought was a smallish community, it was much larger than what they had originally.
Yes, and that's not even the largest one.
Right. No, it's funny as it keeps going around.
That's the one that's sticking up out of the ground that we can
when
see.
When we went, I was curious because I was looking at the stones, and there's a couple of areas where obviously some repairs have been done and whatnot. But I was thinking, would they have left the original stones out here, or maybe are these replicas and the real stones are somewhere else? Honestly, I don't know I don't know which is which.
Those are pretty big stones to be changing.
But still, I mean, hey.
Where are you going to store those?
I don't know. I mean, people have basements. I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway, so that's a little bit of history as it relates to some of the natives that were here, and then obviously progress and westward movement of the American settler and whatnot. I think it's called Tumelsons Port.
Tumelsons Port or Blockhouse Fort.
Okay, and that was the first settlement out in this area, right? Historically.
Absolutely. Yes. In 1835, prior to 1835, we had settlements in Texas. Stephen F. Austin, he was trying to he brought the first Anglo settlers to what was then called Tejas. Mm-hmm. Actually, by that point, it was Coahuila y Tejas. The Spanish had connected the Mexican state of Coahuila with Tejas.
Okay, I got you.
So it was actually called Coahuila y Tejas. And that's how they governed it.
I did not know that.
No,
I've always felt that Chihuahua was the closest state in Mexico.
No, Chihuahua is to our west. So El Paso is part of Chihuahua. Mm-hmm. We were part of Coahuila.
Okay.
And because the Mexican states weren't the same as they are today either.
Right.
Mexico they have changed and we have changed.
That's interesting.
But it's in order to really understand our history here, you have to understand the Mexican history and the Spanish history and some of the French influence. We do not have as much French here, but you do have to understand that. Because they're all connected, especially that era, the 1820s and 1830s, they were all connected we were part of Mexico. As Mexican citizens, we got our freedom from Spain. That was the first step. And in the 1820s and 1830s, at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, when Mexico became an independent country, it was okay for the Anglos. It was actually okay for the Mexicans. But as soon as Santa Anna decided that he was going to, he called himself the Napoleon of the West. That's the name he gave himself. He wanted to be Napoleon.
Interesting.
Period. He wanted to be Napoleon. He wanted to be a dictator. He wanted to have total control. And a lot of people don't realize this, but Mexico, when the Texas Revolution occurred in 1835, 1836, the Yucatan was also revolting at the same time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So, and that comes important later because the Texas Navy, which we had our own Navy because we're on the Gulf, they actually went down to the Yucatan, and they were the Navy that the Yucatan paid in gold for the Texas Navy to be their Navy.
Huh, interesting.
So anyway, it's all connected. We're all connected. So in 1835, Stephen F. Austin, they wanted to expand to the northwest from down in the, let's say, Bryan College Station area, down in that direction. Down, not Houston. Houston hadn't been established yet. But the farthest west at that point was Bastrop. Okay. Bastrop was as far west, and that was almost literally the western frontier for the United States because there was nothing. And the exploration of the Pacific Northwest and California, their exploration had begun, but very little settlement had come, and they had come up. The Spanish again were coming up from Mexico and going up into Baja and up in that direction, up into California, and then a little farther north. But in between there was nothing. Right. In between there was nothing. And
well, a lot of people argue there still is nothing in between.
Absolutely, there's nothing in between.
El Paso, anything to have El Paso. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding, of course. I'm totally
kidding. A little hot that direction.
little warm.
A little warm, a little dry.
So with Tumelsons Port, that was something that came about because of in order for settlers to come this direction, the Comanche were in total control of this area at the time, and the hope was to send what we now call Texas Rangers. They were the ranging corps at the time. They were men that were there to protect citizens from Indian raids, from vagabonds. We had a lot of highwaymen, highway robbery, that kind of thing. It was a scary place. It was the Wild Wild West.
It was the Wild Wild West. There were no friendly things around.
Yeah, ATV wasn't around.
No, ATV wasn't around. There were no convenience stores, and if the weather turned bad, you were in it.
Yeah, you're in it. You're in it.
So they sent the Texas Rangers, the Ranging Corps, up this direction to build a fort in preparation for settlers to come west.
Okay.
And they built it in 1835. It's where Blockhouse Creek is now.
Okay.
Actually, where the Blockhouse Creek, the clubhouse there, that was Mrs. Walker's house. That was where the fort was built.
Are there any remnants of that? Is there anything left over?
No, the tree. The tree is still there, where they had cut steps into an oak tree so that they could climb up it to look out. They were not there very long because of the Texas Revolution, and it was made out of wood blocks.
Okay, so there wasn't really, it was kind of semi-permanent from that perspective.
Yes, and it was never intended to be a permanent,
long-term fort,
because they were hoping to establish this, make it safe. Let's move on to the next place to the west. And
so does that get us now to the Mason wagon train?
Not quite. That was in 1836, those men were pulled back for part of the Texas Revolution.
Okay.
Later that year, the Comanche burned it down.
Okay.
Chief Yellow Wolf, he burned it down. So that was burned down. We don't have our next group of individuals coming up this direction until 1839.
Okay.
In 1839, we have what's called the Western Massacre occurs.
Okay. And now, were there people already starting to settle here, or was that part of it?
There were, between 1836 and 1839, there were 4 people.
Okay.
4 men. And one of those 4 men is James O. Rice. James O. Rice was a Texas Ranger, and he is most likely the prototype for the Lone Ranger.
Oh, okay.
He came up here and built a cabin on what is now Baghdad Road, and I found a map that from 1841 that shows the road going from, basically, let's say the library. Mm-hmm. Where the library is, mm-hmm. it stops there. That's where James O. Rice's cabin was. And that road goes down to basically like 183 Mopac area there, mm-hmm. and then it goes on down to Bastrop. James O. Rice, we had in May of 1839, we have what's called the Battle of the Gabriels, where a gentleman named Manuel Flores, who was an agent of the Mexican government, he was trying to incite the native peoples, the Indians, to come and attack the Republic of Texas and the citizens here.
So was that Comanche at that point?
It was
primarily, or
I believe it was Cherokee. He was headed up to like the Caddo territory, which is in northeast,
gotcha.
The Nacogdoches, up in that area. And James O. Rice and his company, they found Manuel Flores and his company, along with provisions, a lot of provisions, and the letters from the Mexican government to the Indian chief. And I don't remember exactly which Indian tribe and chief it was going to, but we have the documents. And the battle was actually right up just north of here.
So they stopped them from getting that to
yes.
the Indian tribes.
Yes. And,
interesting.
And that was, they had lots of money and munitions, ammunition, the letters. It was a turning point, mm-hmm. actually. It was a significant event in Texas history. And it was right up the road. And part of the reason why James O. Rice could intercept them here is that his cabin was right there on Baghdad Road.
Right.
And the road at the time, so that was May of 1839. Austin was established in December of 1839.
Okay.
So the road didn't go to Austin. The road went to Bastrop.
Gotcha.
That's where the center of life was at that time, was Bastrop. So in 1839, at about that same time, we have James O. Rice doing that, and then we have a gentleman, Webster, the Webster family. They land in Galveston, and Mr. Webster, and I cannot think of his first name at the moment.
That's
sorry.
okay.
There's a lot of names
We'll give
out
you
there.
a pass on that one, Kat. Okay.
He actually hired men to come up here with him, and they were headed. They were going to establish a community. They were going to get their land grant, and they had decided that they were going to get that in what is now Burnett, mm-hmm. along the North San Gabriel River. So he hires wagons and men, and he brings all these provisions, and they start out from, they went to Bastrop, and that's where they all got together. So they start out from Bastrop, and they are headed northwest. And the Comanche, they took exception to this, and the wagon train, they made it to just south of the North San Gabriel River. And they had 2 scouts that were in front. And the 2 scout men, they went up, and there's a ridge. We actually know where this was. It's on private property, but I've actually been up there. We went on a tour one time, and the landowner was gracious enough to show us. Mm-hmm. And you can go up, and there's a ridge, and the men looked out over this ridge, and it was in the summer. It was in June, and they look out, and down below was a Comanche camping ground. There were 4 Comanche tribes that had come together to have summer communion or whatever. They were camping there, and they were hoping that they did not see them, but they did see them. So what they did is the scouts, they get back to the main wagon train, and then the main wagon train, they turn around immediately and head back. They were trying to get back to the Colorado River. That's where safety was. That's where Bastrop was. Austin had not been established. There was kind of the community of Waterloo. Clearly, James O. Rice's cabin was not going to be the protection they needed.
Right.
And they turned around and they came back, and they were going at night. They had to go at night because they thought if they traveled at night, the Indians would not follow. Indians typically did not follow at night, but it turns out they did. And they made it, they came back down, and they made it to just south of the San Gabriel River, about where our bridge is now on 183. And that's when the Comanche caught up with them. The 2 Indian chiefs that I know of were Yellow Wolf and Buffalo Hump. And they attacked the Websters, killed the entire thing. Now there is if you look into the history of the Webster Massacre, there is quite a bit of difference between the number of men that were killed, and the reason why is that the whole expedition, all the records for it were with it. The pay logs and all of that,
gotcha.
Mr. Webster kept that with him.
Right.
So he kept who he was hiring.
Right.
And so what happened? They killed them. You know, they circled the wagons, and there's they talk about different historical reports talk about they survived a certain number of hours, and they had a small cannon. You know, they fought valiantly, and then they all fell. Mrs. Webster and her 2 children were captured, and they lived with the Comanches for I think it was 3 years. And Mrs. Webster did manage to escape. When the Comanche, when you were captured by the Comanche, you basically became their slave. You were not allowed to wear clothes of any kind. The children were separated from the mother. So the mother, she was with one tribe, and each child was with another tribe. And at some point, Mrs. Webster, the tribes met together again, and Mrs. Webster found her daughter, and she managed to talk one of them into allowing her daughter to stay with her, and for a while, and then she escaped, and she made it almost to San Antonio, and she wrote a history of this. She wrote a history of how she escaped, how long it took, and they found her. She had walked as far as she could walk. She could not walk any further. And a Mexican up from Mexico salesman with a cart and a donkey stumbled upon them by the road. And here was this woman and child, clearly emaciated, beaten, naked, and he got them back to San Antonio. And it was what was so important about her escaping at that time is that the Comanche, part of the reason why they had come together is there was supposed to be a peace council in San Antonio where the tribes and the Anglos were supposed to have a peace treaty, and the Comanche had decided that they were not going to do that. They were actually going to attack when they got down there. Yeah. So she had to warn the Anglos that this was actually a setup. So all of that happened, and in later years she wrote it all down, and in her memoirs she says there were 40 men. Now the Texas Rangers, the Ranging Corps, when they came up here, they had followed behind the Webster, the party,
The wagon train.
and they were behind. It had something to do with the cattle and that, so they were a couple of days behind. Well, by the time they made it to where the actual attack had occurred, there were only 14 men that they buried. So they said that there was only 14. Well, the reason why there were only 14 is that's the only remains they could find.
Right. Because if they'd been sitting around for a while.
No, this is the next day.
It was the next day.
Well, this is going to get graphic.
But
don't be offended, but this is fact. Okay. The Comanche, when they defeated a person, when they killed them, they would not only scalp them, they would strip them naked, they would tie them behind a horse, and they would drag them around the prairie until they were dismembered. And so the actual attack happened just south of the St. Gabriel River. They were buried down along Brushy Creek in what is now Davis Cemetery. The historical markers are there. So that's what, 3 miles, 4 miles?
More or less, yeah.
So they had drugged 14 men's bodies to there. And the rest of the bodies were not found. But Mrs. Webster, she says in her memoir, she said she understands that that's what the Rangers did and that's what the Rangers found. But what her husband had hired was 40 men. And she has no explanation of what happened to them.
Right.
But we know that that's how the Comanche Warriors work.
So it's a fair assumption that the Comanches not only, obviously decimated that particular group of settlers, but, I don't know if it would have been, I don't know. I don't know if about Comanche history, what not to say, that they do that on purpose just to ensure that they don't come back.
It worked really well because except for the 4 men that had already built cabins, and it was actually James O'Rice and then Mr. Smeltzer and his 2 son-in-laws, until 1849, no one came.
No one else came back.
So for 10 years, that was it.
And, it's always interesting to me because, when you're a student of history, so you're far more versed in this than I ever would be. But I like to, I'll read the occasional book or whatever, just seeing a historical perspective, kind of like, okay, this is interesting stuff. And I used to do it a lot more than I do now. But I always found it interesting is that we being the Anglos or we being the Mexicans were really the ones that were intruding on the Comanches' land. So while it sounds horrific, obviously, they were kind of their fault.
And the Anglos and the Mexican, and actually the Castilian Mexicans, they're Anglo. Their race is Anglo.
Yeah.
So the Mexicans, someone from Mexico of Mexican heritage,
indigenous,
tends to be a combination of the Spanish, the Castilian Spanish, and the native peoples of the Mexican area.
Yep.
So we have a lot of Anglos.
Right.
and
well, there was a tremendous amount of settlement much prior to the 1800s that we're talking about.
So we had a lot of Spanish settlers from Spain, and they were Anglo because Spanish is Anglo.
Right.
Spain is in Europe.
Yeah, no. I mean, my personally, I'm a first generation American, and my father was, granted citizenship here from Mexico, and so my grandfather. Our family history goes back to, there was a French general, I want to say he was a general, he was a military guy, who came to Mexico, I believe it was during the Spanish-Franco Wars, maybe? That sounds about right. And he stayed. He stayed in Mexico, and then, eventually that was kind of like how our family, the European family came to Mexico and then settled in there for a couple generations before we moved to America. But I totally understand what you're saying from that perspective.
Yeah, and the lines between Mexico and the United States for Texas,
it's
that line
very
is
blurred.
Very blurred.
Yep.
it's not a line.
So let's kind of move
Okay.
things forward. We have the Texas, 1836 and the Alamo and all that stuff, and we move forward. I want to kind of touch a little bit on, because I found this fascinating when you and I first talked, and it was something that I thought was really kind of like, well, that's an interesting topic, is, Civil War and slavery in Texas, and then the freemen of the area.
Okay.
Because we talked a little bit about that the last time you and I met.
So let's back up just a little bit.
Okay.
So Western Massacre of 1839, we don't have our next settlement until 1849, 1851. So that 12 years, the attack worked.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually know a whole lot about that from Yellow Wolf's perspective. In that 10 years, or in 1849, I take that back, when Texas was part of the United States, in 1849 they built, the U.S. military built Fort Croghan in Burnett, which that became the western frontier.
Okay.
And what we call Baghdad Road now was called Military Road, because that's how the military, the U.S. cavalry, went from Austin, Travis County, to Burnett. And they went up Baghdad Road. That's how they traveled. That was the main road for this area. And Chief Yellow Wolf decided to park his tribe in front of the front gate of Fort Croghan. And by this time, he actually had very good relationships with mainly the German settlers in the Kerrville, Llano, that Fredericksburg, that part of the world. So that's how we know a whole lot about our Comanche history, is and from the Comanche perspective, is because Yellow Wolf had good relations with the Germans. And
people took historical records from him, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have one thing that's unique about Texas is that we have had people that have chronicalized from the very, very beginning. They knew that the Texas experience was going to be different than anything else. And it has been. It has turned out to be absolutely unique.
Well, I mean, I know that's a great source of a lot of the Texas pride, if you will, comes from being able to tell that story, to have that rich history that is uniquely Texas.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's been a lone star for a very long time, from the very beginning. There was, when nations do nation building and they create a nation, sometimes it's out of revolution, sometimes not, but almost always out of revolution. You always have a flag. And the Texas flag, even at the very, very beginning stages, has always been a lone star. So that's very interesting with that, and that's a whole other topic.
There's that one that's like kind of like the black and white with the black star in it and stuff like that.
Yeah,
right?
and like the Texas Navy, it was a lone star.
Interesting.
There's Come and Take It, the black and white where it shows the cannon. The cannon. That's one sole thing, but there's stars there with it.
Right.
And that's around the words. There were battle flags that have a single star. Anyway, it's always
because
been,
the stars at night were big and bright.
That's right. So, so in 1851, we have the C.C. Mason wagon train. We had 3 major wagon trains that came to our area, and the 1851 was C.C. Mason. It was led by Colonel C.C. Mason. He had nothing to do with the Civil War. Colonel was the name that you gave the person that was in charge. We did not have a standing military in the United States or in Texas. It was all militia. We did not have those military ranks. He was not in the military. If he had been, he would have been in the War of 1812, but he was not the right time. Colonel Sanders was a real colonel. They call him a Kentucky colonel, but it was an honor given to him because he was the man in charge. Colonel C.C. Mason, he was the man in charge. Today, like our county judge. He's not really a judge, but he's in charge of our county. Similar thing.
Gotcha.
Colonel was the name we used at the time. And and a lot of times he was the most respected individual. He organized and brought a 100 family, 300 wagon train It was over 1.25 miles long. That was a significant wagon train.
And a significant number of people settling.
Absolutely. And so he brought them from right there on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. Charlotte is right on the southern border of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that came from there, they were from Charlotte, the small towns around Charlotte, and then just south of there at the very northern side of South Carolina. And they came and they went through Tennessee, and they picked up more people in Tennessee, and then they came down, and they went to Austin first. Because what you had to do when you were a settler is you had to go to Austin first and talk with the general land office and say, I want to lay a claim for land. Where can I go? And they would tell you the general area for you to go. And then you would go and you would go to that area. You would pay for a surveyor to come and survey it. You would stake it out. You would live on that land for 3 years and improve it. And then you would go back to Austin after 3 years and you would buy that land.
Gotcha.
Now, you were buying it literally pennies on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So you would pay like a quarter an acre for a league in labor. So basically 1,800 acres, you would pay like $500 for it, something of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now the prices varied and all this kind of thing, but the land was not free.
Mm-hmm.
You had to pay for it.
But it was more procedural from that perspective,
yes,
right?
It was more procedural. And I've had people ask me, how did they make sure that no one claimed the same land? Like when the Oklahoma Territory opened up,
mm-hmm.
we had boomers and we had Sooners.
Mm-hmm.
And we had people that literally tried to claim the same land because they did not have that procedure. They just
mm-hmm.
opened it up.
Yeah.
They opened up Oklahoma Territory. Here, come.
Go.
Here. Ask the U.S. government. You
right.
know, they were just as bright back then as they are now. So, you know,
that's funny.
you would think they would learn a lesson from that.
Right.
experience.
No, you would think.
No,
you would think.
No, they didn't. So anyway, in Texas we did a little different. You had to go to Austin, and you got your coordinates of where you needed to go. You staked your claim. You had it surveyed. You went back. You said, here's the survey. Here's my official survey. They put it on the map. They drew it in on the map. And so the next person that came,
they would know where
it was and all that. So we didn't have this duplication.
Right.
And what ended up happening is we had places where there were gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, because of taxes, eventually all land, there was a land grant for all land eventually, except what the state decided to keep for itself.
Gotcha.
Okay, so the state of Texas was laid out a long time ago, and everything was claimed a long time ago. But it took like 100 years or something.
Right.
Over 100 years.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so again, that is another discussion that can take hours.
Right. Well, I was trying to get us to that like Civil War period.
Okay. So we're going to move on to the Civil War. So 1851, C.C. Mason comes. He brings this big wagon train. Most of the people, well, not most, all of the people are from North, South Carolina, and Tennessee. They move here. In 1854, C.C. Mason decided he wasn't going to go through all of that process of staking land, doing all that. He just decided to buy it. And he came here. And there was also Huddleston, and there were the Fabian family. The names of the schools
mm-hmm.
that you see around, that
mm-hmm.
they're named after a person. Most of them were named after original settlers here. And they all decided after they got to Austin, that process, that was going to take too long. They were just going to go ahead and buy land. And they came out here, and C.C. Mason bought what was essentially, at the time, they were calling this area the Baghdad Prairie.
Mm-hmm.
We were all prairie. We did not have cedar trees. They are not native to here. Well, they aren't even cedar. They're junipers. If you notice our oak trees, there's very few oak trees that are hundreds of years old. They're all like 100 years or younger. We didn't have all the oak trees. We didn't have any of the junipers. It was all prairie grass. This was the Baghdad Prairie. And C.C. Mason just bought a big chunk of it. Mr. Huddleston bought a big chunk of it. The Fabians bought a big chunk of it, and that's how they decided to do it. And so they settled here. They started crops. The first crop was wheat. There was also a lot of cattle. I'm descended from C.C. Mason, so I know the story of what they did. He owned basically to Georgetown to Lake Travis, which at the time it was Colorado River. And Land of Good Water ran out in the summer, so they would take the cattle and go to the Colorado River in the summer, which where Lago Vista is now. So he would drive his cattle from here to there, and then drive it back in the springtime or in the fall. So that's how they got water. But in Tonkawan terms, we're talking a very large territory. So the Colorado was still Land of Good Water. Okay, so the community of Baghdad is established, and we still have communication going back and forth, and then we have the Civil War. This area during the Civil War, it was not all, there was a lot of debate. Other parts of the world or other parts of the United States, it was a given. They were going to be a northern state. That's it. Places in the Deep South, they were Confederate, period. Not a question. No debate, not a question. Here in Central Texas, there was a lot of debate. Slavery was not, it existed, but it wasn't common like in the
pervasive.
Deep South. It was not pervasive. You did have slaves, but your relationship was not the same like on a plantation. Your biggest goal here was to survive for the next day. Slavery was expensive. It was expensive. You paid for everything for that person. You owned that person, yes, but you provided food, clothing, education. All the ones that were here, highly educated. It was to your benefit for your slaves to read and write. Your slave children went to school with your own children. They were helping you with their household. You had to provide housing for them. You had to provide everything. So it wasn't, the image that we have in the Deep South, and it was a whole different story there. A whole different story. Those plantations, those southern plantations they were growing tobacco and sugarcane and cotton and all that. Yes, but that's a different story.
Right.
Central Texas, we didn't have those large crops. If you had cattle, you had smaller crops. Everyone worked the crops. Everyone worked the cattle. So we have in Baghdad Cemetery, for instance, we have Union soldiers buried there as well as Confederate soldiers. Also, too, the Confederacy, when Texas voted to join the Confederacy, which there was a lot of debate for that, men lost their lives fighting if they would go Union or Confederate. It was ugly. And I just lost my train of thought about what I was going to say. Anyway, it wasn't what the stereotypical thing that you learn in school. So, C.C. Mason, at the end of the war, and all of the other slave owners, which it wasn't a large community at all. They emancipated all their slaves. I know that C.C. Mason, when he had one family, Robert Mason, and his wife and children. He gave him the cabin that he was living in, which is along, there's a creek called Jinks Branch. He gave him that and about 1,200 acres, I believe. No, it must have been more than that. Let's say 3,000 acres. And it's in where Jinks Branch is now. If you're going up Baghdad Road, there's a small cemetery on the left. That's where it is. And it extended further north up there. There's a AME church. Charles Mason, C.C. Mason's eldest son, paid for that church. And there was also a community center next door to it. He paid for that community center. And the reason why is that in 1854, we had our second wagon train, which was the picket wagon train, much smaller. And there were quite a few slaves with the picket wagon train.
Okay.
I don't know the exact numbers, but there were, I do. There were 54 blacks and 48 whites.
So it was roughly half.
It was roughly half, but more blacks than whites.
Right.
That was the picket wagon train. In 1870, we have the next wagon train, which was our third and final, and that was the Miller Brother wagon train. The Miller Brother wagon train came from just south of Charlotte in the north end of South Carolina, and the villages there, it was all freemen. They started in 1870, and they came here, and they came to Jinks Branch, and Robert Mason sold them land. And Charles Mason helped build the community. He paid for the community to be built here, and it was a freeman community. And I started doing history. This is why you can't just study one little thing. You have to study the other.
No, this is why I found this subject so
it's fascinating. I started researching. I'm like, why did they come here? They had to communicate. It's people from the same communities.
Mm-hmm.
They started there and they came here. They only did it basically 20 years in difference. What was the thing? Well, I started doing research of the communities that the freemen came from, and I found out they did not have any Civil War battles there, but that was like the center of the KKK.
Okay.
So they came from there to get away from the KKK and Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
The Civil War was not the really bad part. The really bad part was Reconstruction. Afterwards.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that much in the history books. But that's the devastating part.
Yeah.
That's the real devastation. So they came here, and they came here. They had to have had a relationship with the Masons, the Huddlestons,
mm-hmm.
the Pickets.
So word came from here to there, said, hey, if you come here, there's community here.
Yes, and there's community here. And during the Civil War, this part of our area here, north of the Colorado River, had already been established as a freeman area. It was friendly mm-hmm. to people of color, of all colors. Mm-hmm. It was considered a safe community to be here. So slaves that were down in the Bastrop, Austin area, they had already started coming out here, and they went to what's called the North Shore, the Jonestown, Lago Vista, Round Mountain area, and which Round Mountain area backs up to what is the Jinks Branch area or the Miller community area. Mm-hmm. So it was already established that if you were a person of color, any color, this is where you came to.
Interesting.
You would be free to live here the way you wanted to live, and you could buy land.
Interesting.
History has a way of taking a lot longer to understand. And as you can clearly tell in this episode, Kat and I had a lot more to discuss, and we went quite a bit further in the conversations on Leander in general. So I invite you to join us for the next episode of Lean and Leander, where we'll pick up where we left off today. So come back next week and enjoy that one, hopefully as much as you enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot, folks. Have a good one.